VR! It's the future of gaming. Well, maybe.
We're almost a decade into the current era of VR, and outside of a couple noteworthy bangers, VR has still struggled to be adapted by major companies and franchises.
But you know who does love VR? Capcom, or more specifically, their Resident Evil team.
They have put out 3, soon to be 4, major VR experiences for the iconic horror franchise. Resident Evil VII Biohazard for the PlayStation VR, Resident Evil 4 for the MetaQuest 2, and Resident Evil Village for the PlayStation VR2.
So here's a question. Are any of these actually worth playing?
After all, these aren't spin-offs or side games, but mainline Resident Evil games playable from start to finish in VR. That's kind of a big deal. Much like how Half-Life Alyx showed how VR can evolve and elevate a beloved series, I truly believe the same is possible for Resident Evil. So today we're going to explore how each of these games handles VR, what's great and not so great about them, and in one case provide an alternate way to play.
Rise and shine, sleepyhead. It's time for supper.
Out of the entire Resident Evil catalog, Resident Evil VII Biohazard may be the best designed to take advantage of VR. The game is set in the intimate and claustrophobic environment of the Baker estate, with the actual explorable space being tiny when compared to the grander scope of other games. As a result, the pace is rather slow, encouraging you to take your time in each room, exploring every nook and cranny and marveling at all the disgusting detail. Resident Evil 7 goes for a hyper-realistic look, and the Baker Mansion feels like a real place in how it's laid out. Putting on a VR headset and being transported to an alien world is cool, but being put into something closer to reality is another thing entirely. Even the game's off-maligned wrecked ship section had me on the edge of my seat thanks to how creepy it is in VR, which is why it's really unfortunate that RE7's VR mode is exclusive to PSVR, and as a result is ultimately disappointing.
And that's because these things, they kind of suck.
They have some pretty severe limitations, like no joysticks for example. So it's not a surprise that the Resident Evil team doesn't even bother using them, instead opting to have the player hold a DualShock 4 controller. The end result is that you don't quite feel like you are protagonist Ethan Winters, but rather are controlling him like you would any other video game. Only your head has now been transported into virtual reality, and also a gun has been duct taped to it. This actually makes combat easier than playing normally, as all you have to do is look at an enemy to lock directly onto their head, robbing a lot of the tension. The game is full of ideas that feel tailor-designed for VR, like holding your hands up to block, pouring health on yourself, or even looking at your watch to see your vitals. But unfortunately, these are still left as button presses. This all feels poor compared to the good we're eating with VR now, and results in a lot of the game's design and potential not fully being taken advantage of. So unfortunately no, RE7's VR does not really do much to change the way you play Resident Evil. But I do think its emphasis on horror makes it a worthwhile game to experience in VR.
It's a real shame that the Resident Evil 7 VR experience is forever tied to this outdated and obsolete piece of hardware.
Is what I would say if we didn't have the good old PC modding community. God bless.
That's right, you can recreate the PSVR experience on your PC and even bring back some of its lost potential, as long as you're willing to put up with some jank that comes with this type of user-created experience. All you need is a VR headset compatible with Steam VR. In my case, I use the MetaQuest 2 with a link cable. I'll provide a link in the description of this video if you want to try this yourself, and honestly, I found the setup process to be fairly easy and straightforward. The greatest thing this PC mod does is it maps the controls to touch-style VR controllers, meaning you can now control Ethan's hands independently. And this isn't just for show, as it completely alters the way combat feels. Gunplay is now frenetic and messy, relying on your own aim instead of headshotting with your eyeballs. And guess what? Holding your hand up triggers the block, and you have to hold the bottle upside down to pour health medicine. And if you look down at your wrist, you just see your health, and it all feels really natural. Finally, these features are reaching their full potential. Granted, because this is a fan mod, there are still a lot of limitations. You aren't going to be picking up objects with your hands or interacting with the environment. I had a lot of issues with button mapping to my controls, and I found weapon switching to be really annoying. The game also defaults to having Ethan's body visible instead of floating arms, which I quickly found to be distracting Thankfully, there's a mod menu you can open up and disable the body. This does unfortunately lead to some cutscene weirdness, like this one where Ethan gets his ghost leg chopped off. But that's the kind of trade-off you're making with this mod over the original. The PSVR may be limited, but it is a cleaner experience. But this is a really great alternative, and likely soon to be the most accessible way to play Resident Evil 7 in VR, as the PSVR itself is now a discontinued product, and the PSVR2 doesn't offer any backwards compatibility. So that's cool.
So what if the developer had more properly dedicated dev time and better VR hardware to take advantage of?
You'd get Resident Evil 4 on the Quest 2, and it f***ing slaps. Everything missing in Resident Evil 7 VR is here. You got fully autonomous hands, direct interactivity with objects like ammo and treasures. The guns all physically reload and feel so good. In short, the VR implementation this time around is great. But what does this actually do to the gameplay of RE4? Why play this version? Well, you are given so much more to do thanks to the integration of the touch controllers. Things like dual wielding, peeking open doors, holding a knife in one hand and a gun in the other. You're simply able to express yourself more in how you play in a way that is just not possible in non-VR. The game plays like a dream, with a large variety of options to tweak to your liking. And because it's on the Quest 2, it's really easy to pick up and play anywhere you want. No PC, no console, no cables. Frankly, I have so little to say because it's just so good. If you like Resident Evil and you like VR, you should play this. Unless, of course, you already own a non-Quest 2 headset and you don't want to buy another VR headset because why would you do that? That's so much money, and boy, I really do not like how once again this game is an exclusive. And yeah, unfortunately, there's just no mod alternative for this one. You have to buy the headset. And speaking of having to buy a headset,
where the hell am I?
For as fantastic as Resident Evil 4 VR is, it didn't scratch the itch left wanting from Resident Evil 7, because they are two wildly different games with very different combat goals. Resident Evil 4 is an action-focused game all about the combat, and RE7 is a horror game that's more about the pacing and the tension. So while Resident Evil 4 VR is a truly amazing experience from the action side of the franchise, it didn't really do anything to satisfy the slow-paced horror I was looking for. I want something that can truly capture that side of Resident Evil in VR.
Which is why I was excited for Village, because on paper it should provide the Resident Evil VR experience I've been waiting for.
It's not. It's not bad, but it's got a lot of glaring issues that gets in its way. But first, I do want to highlight that there is some really cool stuff in here, and I want to give credit where credit is due. The flexibility of handling the weapons is just as great as it was in Resident Evil 4. And hey, you can even throw the knife now. You can also open up Ethan's coat, which you can map items to, such as landmines. There's even a physical flashlight you can hold, an addition I love because it ramps up the tension, forcing you to use only one-handed weapons when in a dark, claustrophobic environment. The map is also something you have to hold, straight out of Far Cry 2, which I completely adore. However, these additions also have their issues or just don't feel as meaningful as they could be. For example, the flashlight becomes a lot less cool once you realize it will automatically turn on anyways, and you don't actually need to pull it out. Or take the reliability of opening up Ethan's jacket. It can be clumsy and not ideal in the heat of battle. Also, it just doesn't work the way you think it would sometimes. Here's me trying to take out and throw a mine on the ground. Turns out you need to press it, and it just drops to the ground. It's just a weird holdover from how it works in the non-VR version. And then there's Ethan's body. It's physically present the whole time, instead of just being a pair of floating hands, and I find this experience less enjoyable as a result. You may think seeing his arms would be more realistic, but instead, you just kind of feel disconnected once you notice they don't always match up with your own arms. And the body really gets in the way during cutscenes where Ethan moves on his own. In Village, most of the cutscenes are played in real time, rather than a video that plays on a screen like in 7 and 4. And originally, I thought I would prefer this because it doesn't break the illusion. But this ends up also breaking it, only in different ways, like having your body disconnect from your head as it keeps walking, or having Ethan wake up lying on the ground, but you are still very much standing up straight in your own living room, and the whole thing feels very silly. However, there are moments where it all comes together beautifully. Once you get to Castle Dimitrescu, the VR starts to shine more because the game lets you play around more. And the castle is beautiful in VR, like, god damn. And of course, there's House Beneviento. That shit is still f***ing awful and horrifying, and I really wish I could have experienced that for the first time in VR. I realize some of this might sound nitpicky, and I'll admit, a lot of the VR features in this game are cool additions and leagues better than what we got in 7. But 4 set the bar really high, and at the end of the day, a lot of Village's design gets in the way. I should also mention that the PC VR mod for RE7 also works with Village. So, if you want, you can play this on PC. However, it is a very limited VR experience in the same way that the 7 mod is. And in this case, the lack of polish on the touch controls, weapon handling, and lack of additional features like the flashlight make it a downgrade when compared to the PSVR2 version. If you want the best possible VR experience, you gotta play it on PlayStation.
Which once again brings us to the biggest problem surrounding all 3 of these games. It is an exclusive locked down to only one VR headset. Yes, it is technically a very nice headset, and for VR it's actually a pretty good deal, but it is still way too expensive for most people to justify.
It's unfortunate that price and exclusivity complicate and ultimately dictate the conversation, when originally all we wanted to know was, are these cool ways to play Resident Evil? And the answer is, yeah, they totally are. Resident Evil 4, no-brainer. It's the winner, so to speak. Village, meanwhile, ends up feeling the most ambitious, but ends up being jankier because it still has to work within the restrictive limitations that arise from a game not being created with VR in the first place. I think the reason why RE4 ends up being the stronger of the two is thanks to the game's more simple presentation translating better to VR. It's also a standalone product and certainly got more development time and money put into it than Village's VR mode, which was created almost 2 years after release. And even though its VR implementation is the weakest, I found RE7 as a game to be a better fit for VR simply because its genre and design lend to the atmospheric aspects that VR is so good at amplifying. The intense dread of the Baker estate feels more real than any of the locations in Village and 4, and makes the whole illusion work more effectively. This leaves me very curious about the upcoming Resident Evil 4 Remake VR mode. The VR for the original Resident Evil 4 is damn near perfect, and if they copy that instead of how they handled Village, I think this could be their best attempt at VR yet. But personally, I'd really love to see what a full-blown VR-only Resident Evil game could truly be. One that is more in the vein of survival horror than survival action. Imagine, if you will, a remake of Resident Evil 1 exclusively for VR, and how freaking cool that would be. I'm talking about having to bend over and douse zombies in oil and light it on fire so it doesn't come back. Interactive puzzles, like needing to push crates to block doors. And of course, you have to play Moonlight Sonata on the piano. So cool. It's not gonna happen. Or will it? Come on, Capcom. Come on, Capcom. Come on. You know you want to.